aligning waiver programs with advocacy. Welcome to the CarePayments Pod. I'm Fady Sahhar, co-author of the Value-Based Payment blog and Dual Eligible HQ. And with me today is my friend and colleague, Dr. Janet Williams, founder of Minds Matter LLC, but more importantly, a national advocate for people with brain injuries. Janet, so good to have you with us.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. It's a true honor to hang out with you for a little bit.
Excellent, excellent. So, Janet, you and I met as advocates, and we've had the opportunity to work on a few things together. But your journey's been a lot different than the one I took, and you've had some amazing accomplishments. Give us some highlights before we get into the waiver programs.
You know, I originally intended to be a lawyer and ended up getting my degree in social work. And my first job was in a nursing home. And so when I went to the nursing home, it was with older folks, and they were attritioning out the older people and bringing in young adults with brain injuries. It was the early 80s. It was when people were first being saved. And they had this idea that young people with brain injuries would be in nursing homes forever. It was called long-term rehab. And I was 22 and walked in and thought, I don't think I'd want to live here the rest of my life. And as a social worker, my job was discharge planning, and there really was nowhere for people to go. It was before the Katie Beckett waiver. I think the Katie Beckett waiver may have happened while I was working there. The independent living centers were just starting, and I just got this bug that people kept telling me they wanted to go home, and I kept saying, okay, let's figure out how you can go home. And so that's how I got started. And from there, I had the great fortune to meet Marilyn Price Spivak, and she talked me into joining the National Head Injury Foundation, which is the Brain Injury Association of America now. And so I was the first paid staff member to work with her, and basically followed her around the country watching the most formative advocate I've ever met walk through the halls of Washington and walk into the kitchens of people. And she was mom of Debbie, and she totally got it. And I sat there and thought, okay, something's missing in our system. We need to figure this out. And as people kept asking me how to get home, I just put my head down and said, let's figure out how you can get home. From there, I decided I needed a PhD because everything in brain injury is medical model. It's all doctors, it's all physicians, it's all PhDs talking about the research. And not a lot of people in those days were out in the community seeing what was happening. Dr. Al Condalusi was a good friend of mine, or is a good friend of mine, and he was doing some really great work on social capital. So he and I started working together, and I thought, there's something to this. People want to live in their own home, and we need to figure out how to make systems do that. So my PhD was even focused on what is it that creates community for people with brain injuries. And I know it'll shock you, Fady, but funding. If there's money for people to live in the community, they will live in the community. If you fund it, they will come, right?
Absolutely. And you've had some amazing success in the Kansas waiver for brain injury, where I think you've created a model that many of us are uh, in awe of, but also you've had some of our common mentors, as you bring up folks like Al Candelusi and from the Pennsylvania area. So tell us more about Kansas, though, and how it works with consumers and some of the results that you've been able to achieve.
So you can imagine, I grew up in Massachusetts, in Boston, got my bachelor's and master's, and decided to get my PhD at the University of Kansas because they had the #1 special ed program in the country. And that is the only way I thought I could create an interdisciplinary degree. So when I moved to Kansas, they said, oh, we're starting this thing called the brain injury waiver through Medicaid, the first in the country. And I started kind of digging in and working with the state of Kansas, figuring out what that meant and how we could look at the independent living philosophy. For me, Nothing for me without me is one of our core principles, and self-direction of services. And I felt like the more control people had of their own services, the better life would be. We want to be involved in conversations about us. And so that was one of the guiding principles that really started me on the Kansas journey. We have written this waiver so there can be no congregate living, no congregate group homes, no outpatient. Everything is in the person's own home and community. That does several things. One, obviously, it gives people the ultimate control. But on the other side of things, it really, really pushes the system to include people and have them be in control of their own lives. It was the final rule before there was a final rule. And the 80s and 90s. A number of other states have tried to model Kansas, but they took a more protective, less independent living philosophy mode of, people need to graduate, they need to do well here before they go there. We've just never believed that. We've always said, get people home, give them the supports and services they need, and let people kick us to the curb. So that's always kind of been our philosophy. The waiver started with only 13 people allowed to be on it. Now we have about 1,500.
Wow.
We call it a rehabilitation waiver, but it's really a transition waiver where people get on, they get the services they need, and then they can transition to another waiver if they need attendant care still, or they can do working healthy. There are a lot of off ramps to this waiver. Average amount of time is about 3 to 4 years. And so we don't have a waiting list on this waiver. People come
Oh,
on,
wow.
they get what they need, they move off. And we've been really, really happy with that, especially as we start seeing in other states, either the brain injury waiver will be folded into other waivers, or they have really long waiting lists. And
Yes.
so we would love to see other states kind of adopt this model of take what you need, become as independent as possible. And we all know that none of us are completely independent, right? Isn't that the independent living philosophy? It's more interdependent. We rely on each other. So we help people figure out, like, what can your neighbor do for you, and what can you do for your neighbor? How can you get your meds delivered? How can you remember your appointments? And having all of those systems in place around a person. So it's been really fun. It's been really successful. As you said, at the heart of things, I'm an advocate, and no one ever thought I'd become a provider of services. And here I am, 35 years later, providing services. And I joke with the people on my team, we need to keep this provider thing going so I can continue to advocate and fight for people.
Yeah, it's fascinating because as we both are grounded in the independent living philosophy. But what I found very exciting in working with you and learning more about what went on in Kansas is that you've been able to achieve a lot of excellent results while actually building and living the independent living philosophy. So tell me a little bit about the results, the outcomes that you've been able to achieve, because especially in a world where we have quite a few established residential brain injury providers, and we have MCOs and other parties involved in trying to shelter us as individuals with disabilities. You've been able to really demonstrate that you can make results happen. Tell me a little bit more. I've heard some of the stories, but our audience hasn't.
Yeah, so managed care came to Kansas about 13 years ago. We were the first ones to have every waiver put in to managed care with insurance companies. And as you know, they throw around words like medical necessity, prior authorization, utilization. Those were all new words to me. I was used to going to the state hospital, meeting someone with a brain injury, writing up an assessment, faxing it to the state, going and picking, helping the person find a place to live, and away we go, right? So there were a lot of systems that I had to learn about. Um, I would say a couple of the big challenges: everybody wants a quick fix. Everybody wants a place for people to go. Where can we put him? Where can we put her? And so that's why I think residential is so popular. Let's protect people by sticking them in a group home or stick them in an
Mhm.
apartment with cameras. Don't even get me started. So that the agency owns the housing, or now, they'll start a nonprofit that owns the housing and say they don't own the housing, but they own. We all know they own the housing and control the housing. We've always been really pure about working with landlords, working with housing, working with HUD, knowing when the Section 8 list opens up, getting to know the managers of all of the HUD high rises, and truly, as Al would say, being of the community with people. That way, we can be in someone's life as long as they want us in their life. And then we always joke that, our best success is when we get kicked to the curb. What we are noticing for the insurance companies is it costs a lot less. And we know that it's dollar signs for these insurance companies. So we may get in there pretty intensively with some services in the beginning, but as we taper off and have fewer and fewer services, the MCOs are able to meet their margins, meet their utilization, and do well. So that line of advocacy versus providing the services, it is really, really thin. It and it takes a minute for people to understand what we're doing and how we're
Absolutely.
doing it. We had some
Mhm.
big battles in the beginning with MCOs wanting to. We would recommend an amount of service, and they decided, oh, we would do half the amount in half the time, and we would get a denial. Well, we figured out with the system that we could appeal that. At one time we had 60 open appeals with one insurance company. Well, they also get graded on how many appeals they have. And we were ready to go to state fair hearing, and we were ready for our disability rights center to file a class action lawsuit because people with brain injuries weren't getting what they needed. Guess what? That got the insurance company to the table pretty quickly. And it ended up being very, very successful, because we are looking at the same things they're looking at. We don't want people having to go back to the hospital. We want people to have long term success in the community because that's what people want. They don't want to go back to a hospital, they don't want to go back to a nursing home. They want fewer people coming and going from their house. That's what they're telling us. So we're saying, okay, how can we do that? So our philosophy has always been, we don't want to create dependence with these services. We really want to support people to be independent. It took a minute for the insurance companies to get it. They would get a plan of care with lots of therapy and 24-hour attendant care. And they thought, oh, we can't pay for this forever. And we would say, you're not going to pay for it forever. Only 2%, 5 years later, would still require 24-hour support. But people with brain injuries aren't usually given the opportunity to see that. Once they're in a group home, it's 24/7 forever. And the insurance
Right.
companies pay for 24/7 forever. And we're saying, no, let us get up front. Let us give people the supports and services, and we will prove that to you. So we've got some good numbers that we're starting to crunch, and a lot of good data showing. Um, the other really funny thing is all this talk about social determinants of health, right? When I first
Oh,
saw
yeah.
that coming from insurance companies, I was like, oh, what's this? I was like, oh, food, clothing, and shelter? Yeah, we've been doing that from day one. That is the independent living philosophy, right, Fatty?
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating as you're talking, Janet, is that, when a few years back we convinced the ACL to make nursing home transition the fifth pillar of the independent living philosophy, some of
Right.
us have been doing it forever. And we found that in many ways, the advocacy was easier with the MCOs once we said, what we're really doing is we're taking a person who would normally be in a nursing facility, costing you a lot more, to living in a community where you're only responsible for some of their care and they're able to be as independent as possible. You and I need to do this again and again and again because our advocacy is never going to stop. So please tell me you'll be willing to come back and join us one more time.
100%. Always and
Thank
forever.
Janet, it's been a pleasure as always. And for our audience and our listeners out there, first of all, continue to advocate because we're never going to be done with it. And as always, onward.
The Care Payments Pod is brought to you by XtraGlobex. XtraGlobex is a strategic consulting firm that works with companies that are at an inflection point. We work with organizations to help manage that change and meet your goals. What is your challenge? Let us help take you onward. Link in the bio for a free consultation. Visit us at XtraGlobex.com.